They never made it home. The night didn't end in chaos. It ended in silence. A car turned off a familiar road and history closed over it. For 24 years, Lincoln County lived with a missing moment. 3 teenagers vanished together, without witnesses, without debris, without a single confirmed mistake. What remained was absence. Absence shaped memory. Absence shaped rumor. Absence shaped an investigation that never stopped asking the same question. Where did they go? The night began without urgency. Prom ended the way it always did in 1992. Lights came up. Music faded. Parents waited. Joseph Mulaney, 18th, drove his silver 1989 Pontiac Grand Prix. William Hamilton sat beside him. Nikki Bakolas rode in the back. They left the school parking lot at 11:45. Several classmates saw the car pull out. No one reported concern. No one followed. The destination wasn't secret. Miller's Lake Overlook was a known stop. Teenagers went there to talk, to watch the water, to delay going home. That detail mattered later. At the time, it meant nothing. Joseph Mulaney was known for routines. He worked part-time. He kept his car clean. He called home when plans changed. William Hamilton had a similar pattern. He didn't miss curfew. Nikki Bakolas kept a diary. Her entries described ordinary worries. School. Friends. Summer plans. None suggested escape. None suggested conflict. That absence of warning became the first problem investigators faced. There was no reason to run. There was no reason to hide. There was no reason to disappear together. By morning, concern replaced assumption. The Pontiac never returned. Joseph's parents called friends. William's family checked nearby roads. Nikki's mother searched the overlook. No tire marks. No broken glass. Officer Robert Lane canvassed the area. He documented what wasn't there. No skid marks. No fresh soil. No water disturbance. The lake's surface was calm. Searches expanded outward. Fields. Woods. Quarry access roads. Nothing connected. Each negative result narrowed possibilities without creating answers. Detective Michael Hayes took the lead within 48 hours. He reconstructed timelines from fragments. Last sightings? Estimated drive times. Fuel range diet. He treated the absence as evidence. A vehicle doesn't vanish by accident, he noted later. It leaves something behind. But days passed. Then weeks. The car was reported nationwide. VIN numbers entered databases. Detective Sarah Collins coordinated with families. She recorded statements. She noted consistency. Stories didn't drift. Details didn't inflate. Grief stayed focused. That steadiness mattered. It reduced false narratives. It also deepened the mystery. Rumors filled the space evidence couldn't occupy. Runaway theories surfaced. So did drug stories. None held under review. No withdrawals. No financial movement. No phone activity. Prosecutor Daniel Hayes reviewed early findings. He advised caution. Without a crime scene, speculation could contaminate later proceedings. That restraint shaped public messaging. It also frustrated the community. People wanted certainty. The case offered none. Years passed. Searches repeated with new technology. Sonar scanned water. Cadaver dogs worked land. Lab analyst Jennifer Cole reviewed trace items from the overlook. Nothing linked. Mark Turner verified results. Chain of custody held. There was simply no material to test. Each review returned the same conclusion. The case remained open. It also remained empty. The turning point didn't come from memory. It came from construction. In July 2016, workers broke concrete at Dry Creek Industrial Park. They exposed a roof. Not debris. Not scrap. A vehicle roof. Police secured the site. Officer Linda Martinez documented the scene. 2 feet of concrete sat above the car. Inside were 3 sets of remains. Prom clothes still in place. Keys in the ignition. Gear in neutral. The Pontiac had not crashed. It had been placed. Time collapsed. 24 years compressed into a single excavation. Families were notified. Identification followed. Records matched. The missing moment had a location. It also raised new questions. How the car got there. when the concrete was poured. Who knew? Detective Michael Hayes returned to the earliest assumptions. He compared them against the physical facts. Some theories failed immediately. Others survived. What investigators learned first came from documents. Building permits showed a foundation poured in June 1993. Court records later confirmed the timing. Witness statements described an overnight pour, unplanned, isolated. Detective Sarah Collins compared that date to the disappearance. The gap mattered. It suggested control, not coincidence. Lab analyst Jennifer Cole assessed the vehicle condition. There was no impact deformation. No airbag deployment. That absence aligned with placement. Mark Turner confirmed measurements. Clearances matched pit dimensions. The site told a story without words. The discovery forced restraint. Prosecutors reviewed standards carefully. Emily Roberts emphasized language. Accidental but suspicious became the official phrasing. It acknowledged evidence without overstating proof. Families heard something else. They heard intention implied, then withheld. That tension defined the case's new phase. But at this moment, the facts stood alone. A car, a slab, a timeline, and 3 lives interrupted, preserved by concrete, then returned to record. Nothing in the scene resolved blame, but everything ended the disappearance, replacing uncertainty with place, date, and an obligation to understand what followed. Next steps. The disappearance changed Lincoln County before it ever produced answers. Consequences came first, explanations later. In the days after May 16, 1992, the town shifted its behavior. Parents drove routes they once trusted. Curfews tightened without discussion. The overlook at Miller's Lake emptied. What had been ordinary space became suspect terrain. That transformation mattered because it revealed how little the community actually knew. Fear didn't grow from evidence. It grew from the absence of it. Detective Michael Hayes noted the pattern early. When facts are missing, people supply meaning. Rumors didn't emerge randomly. They followed social fault lines. Outsiders were mentioned first. Then older teenagers. Then construction workers near the lake. None of these ideas came with proof. Officer Robert Lane logged tips daily. Most were second-hand. Many contradicted each other. A few were sincere but unverifiable. Each tip still required time. Each consumed resources. That consequence shaped the investigation more than any single lead. The families experienced consequence differently. Joseph Mulaney's parents stopped changing his room. William Hamilton's mother kept the porch light on every night. Nikki Bakolas' diary became evidence, not memory. Detective Sarah Collins handled those materials with care. She understood their dual weight. They humanized the victims, but they also carried expectation. Every page raised the same unspoken question. What did we miss? The answer again was nothing concrete. Public belief hardened within months. The runaway narrative gained traction because it offered resolution. It implied choice. It removed threat. Prosecutor Daniel Hayes later explained why that mattered. If disappearance is framed as voluntary, urgency fades. Resources redirect. Witnesses stop questioning their own recollections. That framing didn't come from police statements. It came from repetition. Talk radio. Church meetings. School hallways. Over time, assumption replaced inquiry. Detectives worked against that drift. They emphasized routine. None of the 3 teens prepared to leave. No packed bags. No drained accounts. No farewell messages. Lab analyst Jennifer Cole reviewed personal items recovered from homes. Clothing patterns suggested short-term plans. Formal wear returned to closets. Everyday clothes stayed folded. Mark Turner verified inventories. There were no gaps consistent with departure. Those findings didn't convince everyone, but they anchored the case in behavior, not theory. Context also came from geography. Miller's Lake sat near developing land. In 1992, zoning records showed multiple proposed projects. Some stalled. Some advanced quietly. Officer Linda Martinez collected historical maps. She overlaid them with search grids from the early weeks. The overlap revealed something uncomfortable. Areas later built over had been searched only superficially. At the time, that made sense. There was no indication to dig. There was no reason to suspect burial. That limitation became clear only in hindsight. The passage of time created its own consequences. Witness memories shifted. Statements recorded months later differed slightly from initial interviews. Not in direction, but in emphasis. Detective Michael Hayes flagged those changes. He didn't treat them as deception. He treated them as erosion. Memory decays without reinforcement. That reality constrained later reconstructions. Timelines grew softer at the edges. Precision gave way to ranges. That loss could not be reversed. By the late 1990s, the case occupied a strange place. It was active on paper, dormant in practice. Annual reviews occurred. New detectives read old files. Each asked the same initial question. How does a car disappear? The answer was still missing. That repetition produced fatigue. Not indifference, but limitation. Resources favored solvable cases. This one resisted even classification. The families felt that shift acutely. They pushed for renewed searches. They funded flyers. They spoke to media when anniversaries returned. Detective Sarah Collins maintained contact. She explained constraints plainly. Without new evidence, investigative options narrow. That transparency preserved trust. It did not produce progress. The case remained suspended between memory and procedure. Then, development accelerated. Industrial projects moved forward near Dry Creek. Permits were issued. Foundations poured. No alerts triggered. No missing vehicle matched the location. Context explains why. In 1993, databases were fragmented. VIN searches depended on known locations. There was no system to flag burial beneath private construction. That gap wasn't negligence. It was structural. When the car was finally discovered decades later, that context reshaped interpretation. The community revisited its assumptions. The runaway theory collapsed instantly. So did the idea of a spontaneous accident in open space. The consequence was cognitive. People recognized how early framing had narrowed imagination. That recognition didn't assign blame. It assigned responsibility to process. Investigators revisited their own decisions. Detective Michael Hayes compared early search parameters to the discovery site. He acknowledged the mismatch. At the time, nothing pointed there. Later, everything did. That contrast illustrated the core lesson of the case. Context determines possibility. What cannot be imagined cannot be searched. Chapter 2 rests on that understanding. Before evidence reappeared, the town lived with consequence. Behavior changed. Belief hardened. The investigation adapted to absence rather than action. Those shifts didn't solve the case. They shaped how it weighted. Before they became a case, they were ordinary in ways that mattered. The investigation would later rely on records, measurements, and permits. But it was their lives that gave meaning to the absence. Detective Sarah Collins insisted on that focus early. She believed understanding who they were clarified what they were not. They were not reckless. They were not disappearing. They were not preparing to leave anything behind. Joseph Mulaney was 18 and careful by habit. He balanced school with a part-time job and kept predictable hours. His parents described him as steady. He maintained his car himself. Oil changes were logged. The interior stayed clean. That detail later intersected with forensic findings, but first it spoke to character. Joseph valued control over small things. That pattern extended to communication. If plans shifted, he called. On prom night, he didn't. That silence was the first break from routine. William Hamilton shared similar structure. Friends described him as dependable, not impulsive. He followed curfews without argument. His family recalled that he rarely stayed out late without notice. The prom was an exception, but not a departure. Formal events carried flexibility. After parties didn't. He brought no extra clothing. No overnight bag. His wallet contained cash, consistent with a short evening. Detective Michael Hayes later noted that detail. People planning escape prepared differently. Nikki Bakolas was 18 and reflective. She kept a diary with regular entries. Lab analyst Jennifer Cole reviewed those writings for context, not clues. The entries described everyday concerns. Exams. Friendships. Anticipation of graduation. There were no expressions of fear. No references to conflict that night. Nikki wrote about the dress she chose, about music she liked, about summer approaching. Those pages anchored her in the present. They didn't point away from it. Their relationships overlapped naturally. They attended the same school. They shared social circles without exclusivity. There was no indication of secrecy between them. Officer Linda Martinez interviewed classmates who saw them leave together. The accounts matched. No tension. No urgency. Just departure. That consistency mattered. It removed scenarios involving sudden dispute or panic. The choice to go to Miller's Lake overlooked fit established behavior. Teenagers went there to talk, not to hide. Family routines reinforced that picture. Joseph's parents waited up, as they often did. William's household expected him back before midnight. Nikki's mother noted the time carefully. None received a call. None received a message. That collective silence created immediate concern. It also created a shared timeline. All three stopped communicating within the same narrow window. That alignment suggested a single interruption, not individual decisions. Detective Sarah Collins documented personal spaces meticulously. Bedrooms reflected continuity. Posters remained. School materials were arranged for upcoming weeks. No packed suitcases. No missing essentials. Clothing inventories showed nothing gone beyond what they wore that night. Prom attire wasn't chosen for travel. It was chosen for a few hours. That distinction mattered. It narrowed plausible outcomes. The human cost extended beyond immediate family. Teachers noticed empty desks. Employers called parents. Graduation lists included names that wouldn't walk. The community felt the loss in fragments. Detective Michael Hayes later described it as dispersed grief. No single ceremony marked the absence. It unfolded through routine disruption. That fragmentation prolonged uncertainty. It also sustained attention. Investigators used that context to challenge early narratives. Runaway theories failed behavioral review. None of the three displayed patterns associated with planned departure. No withdrawals. No notes. No expressed dissatisfaction with home life. Prosecutor Daniel Hayes reviewed those assessments. He supported keeping the case open under a missing persons classification rather than voluntary absence. That decision preserved investigative authority. It didn't produce evidence, but it prevented closure by assumption. Years later, when the car was discovered, the condition of the remains intersected with these early observations. Prom clothing still worn confirmed the timeline. They hadn't changed. They hadn't lingered elsewhere. The moment of disappearance aligned with the moment of death. That realization validated the family's insistence. The teenagers never moved on from that night. They never had the chance. Lab analyst Mark Turner confirmed that personal items found inside the vehicle matched inventories recorded in 1992. Wallets, jewelry, shoes. Nothing suggested removal or redistribution. That consistency mattered legally and narratively. It supported a sudden shared event. It reinforced the understanding of them as victims of circumstance imposed, not chosen. Their humanity reframed later debate. When officials discussed accidental versus deliberate burial, families returned to who their children were. Careful. Planned. Expected home. Detective Sarah Collins echoed that perspective without advocacy. She presented facts rooted in behavior. The lives they lived constrained the explanations that followed. Chapter 3 rests there. Before theories. Before rulings. Before concrete. Three teenagers with routines interrupted at the same minute. Their ordinary choices narrowed extraordinary explanations. Their lives didn't solve the case. They defined its boundaries. Risk didn't announce itself that night. It accumulated quietly, through narrowing options and missed intersections. Detective Michael Hayes described escalation not as action, but as constraint. With each hour that passed after 11:45, the range of benign explanations shrank. By dawn, mechanical failure seemed unlikely. By the second day, voluntary disappearance no longer fit behavior. Risk grew because probability shifted, not because evidence appeared. The first escalation came from time. Vehicles break down. Drivers get lost. Those events usually produce contact. A phone call. A tow record. A witness. None surfaced. Officer Robert Lane checked service stations along likely routes. No transactions. No sightings. Fuel logs showed nothing matching the Pontiac. That absence elevated concern. It suggested interruption rather than delay. The second escalation came from geography. Miller's Lake overlook sat near multiple access points. Some were paved. Others were informal construction paths. Detective Sarah Collins mapped them manually. She compared 1992 layouts against county records. The terrain included drop-offs, shallow water, and open pits tied to stalled projects. Each presented theoretical danger. Searches targeted the most obvious first. Water, .e. Deep embankments. Quarries. Results came back negative. Risk shifted again. The obvious hazards had been ruled out. Weather added pressure. Rain fell intermittently in the days after the disappearance. If the car had left the road, tracks would degrade. Officer Linda Martinez documented soil conditions. She noted compaction near the overlook. No disturbance matched vehicle weight. That detail mattered later. At the time, it removed another possibility. The escalation wasn't dramatic. It was incremental. Each eliminated option forced investigators toward less visible scenarios. Families felt that escalation viscerally. Every hour without confirmation altered expectation. Detective Sarah Collins managed communication carefully. She avoided reassurance unsupported by facts. That honesty preserved trust, but it also conveyed gravity. The families understood the implication. Silence past a certain point suggested incapacity. Something had prevented all three from acting. Investigators assessed interpersonal risk next. Conflicts. Threats. Debts. None emerged. Teachers reported no recent disputes. Employers noted no tension. Friends described normal interactions at prom. That assessment reduced targeted violence probability. It didn't eliminate risk. It redirected it toward situational threat. An event affecting all occupants simultaneously. The lack of witnesses intensified concern. The Pontiac was distinctive. Silver paint. Recognizable body style. Traffic along county roads was light but present. Detective Michael Hayes requested state assistance. Highway patrol logs were reviewed. No reports matched. That gap implied either isolation or concealment. Both elevated severity. As days turned into weeks, the investigation entered a different risk phase. Resource allocation became critical. Active cases competed for attention. Prosecutor Daniel Hayes advised maintaining missing persons status with potential foul play dyad. That classification justified continued expenditure. It also signaled seriousness internally. Externally, messaging remained cautious. Authorities avoided alarming language without proof. Risk assessment guided tone. False leads increased during this phase. Tips reported sightings in other states. Officer Robert Lane followed up. Each lead dissolved under scrutiny. Dates didn't align. Descriptions conflicted. Vehicles mismatched. These pursuits consumed time. They also introduced noise. Detectives learned to triage aggressively. Only leads altering risk calculations received priority. The escalation wasn't only investigative. It was social. Teenagers altered behavior. Parents imposed restrictions. Community events referenced the disappearance indirectly. Detective Sarah Collins noted this ambient change. Fear reshaped routine. That consequence mattered because it influenced witness behavior. People reinterpreted past observations through a lens of threat. Statements taken later carried that bias. Investigators accounted for it when weighing credibility. By the end of the first year, the case reached a plateau. Risk remained high, but avenues narrowed. The car had not surfaced. The teens had not contacted anyone. No physical evidence suggested survival. Detective Michael Hayes documented the shift. The probability curve had moved decisively. Survival became unlikely. That assessment was internal. Publicly, language stayed neutral. Escalation returned years later, unexpectedly. In 2001, a retired detective reopened aspects of the case. He focused on nearby quarries. The theory suggested delayed discovery. Searches were conducted. Equipment scanned water. Again, nothing emerged. That failure reinforced an uncomfortable conclusion. If the car wasn't in obvious hazard zones, it might be somewhere intentionally obscured. That possibility raised a different kind of risk. It implied human involvement beyond accident. Prosecutor Emily Roberts later explained the distinction. Accidental deaths present closure challenges. Deliberate concealment presents accountability challenges. The evidence at that stage couldn't support either conclusively. Investigators documented the fork without choosing a path. Risk escalated again with development. Construction increased near Dry Creek. Detective Michael Hayes monitored permits loosely. There was no legal basis to halt projects. No evidence connected the case to those sites. The risk was theoretical. Still, maps were updated. Locations noted. The concern was preservation. If the vehicle lay buried unknowingly, construction could destroy evidence. That risk went unrealized for decades until it didn't. When the car was finally uncovered, escalation reached its peak retrospectively. The risk that had grown invisibly became fact. The Pontiac had been placed where no one thought to look. The timeline suggested control. That realization reframed every earlier decision. Investigators reviewed their escalation assessments. Many had been sound within available context. Some had been constrained by imagination. Chapter 4 ends with that understanding. Risk didn't explode. It tightened. It narrowed options until only unlikely explanations remained. The danger wasn't a sudden event. It was the gradual closing of exits, unnoticed until all were gone. The crime itself had to be reconstructed without witnesses, without motion, without noise. Investigators didn't begin with what happened. They began with what could not have happened. Detective Michael Hayes approached it as a process of exclusion. The Pontiac did not crash at speed. It did not strike a fixed object. It did not plunge from height. Those conclusions came decades later, but the reconstruction depended on physical facts preserved by concealment. When the vehicle was exposed beneath Dry Creek Industrial Park, its condition immediately reframed the event. Lab analyst Jennifer Cole examined the body panels first. There was no front-end collapse, no lateral compression, no intrusion consistent with loss of control. Mark Turner verified measurements against manufacturer specifications. Deformation fell within tolerances expected from static load, not impact. That single finding removed an entire class of explanations. Whatever happened, it wasn't a high-speed accident. Inside the car, the details carried equal weight. The keys remained in the ignition. The gear selector rested in neutral. Parking brake position suggested the vehicle was stationary when last engaged. These weren't dramatic clues. They were procedural ones. Detective Sarah Collins emphasized their combined significance. Drivers who lose control don't leave vehicles in neutral. Drivers who crash don't keep keys neatly placed. The configuration suggested deliberate handling at the final moment. The position of the remains reinforced that assessment. All three occupants stayed seated. Seat belts were not engaged. There was no evidence of scrambling or repositioning. Prom attire remained intact. Shoes stayed on. Lab analysis found no defensive damage to the interior. No broken handles. No torn fabric. That absence suggested no struggle inside the vehicle. It pointed toward sudden immobilization rather than conflict. The environment surrounding the car filled in the rest. The vehicle sat in a pit consistent with construction staging. Soil composition matched fill used during early site preparation. Concrete above showed uniform curing. No cracks indicated later disturbance. Officer Linda Martinez documented stratification carefully. Layers corresponded with known construction phases from 1993. That timeline mattered. It placed the burial more than a year after the disappearance. That gap forced investigators to separate death from concealment. Prosecutor Daniel Hayes explained the distinction internally. The teens likely died shortly after vanishing. The burial occurred later. That separation introduced new complexity. Where was the car during the intervening period? How was it stored? Who had access? Those questions couldn't be answered definitively. But the physical evidence established sequence. Detective Michael Hayes reconstructed a plausible path without asserting certainty. The Pontiac left the prom. It headed toward Miller's Lake. Somewhere along that route, movement stopped. There was no sign of crash. No sign of abandonment in open space. The car was later relocated to a construction pit. That relocation required equipment. It required time. It required privacy. These weren't conclusions about motive. They were logistical observations. The lack of damage to the undercarriage suggested controlled placement. Scraping consistent with ramps or lifting points appeared laterally. Lab analyst Mark Turner measured those marks. They aligned with standard machinery contact, not ground impact. That detail mattered because it suggested professional familiarity. Not necessarily criminal intent, but capability. Someone knew how to move heavy objects without destroying them. Cause of death could not be determined precisely. Time and environment erased soft tissue evidence. The medical examiner relied on context. There were no bullet casings. No sharp force indicators. No binding materials recovered. The ruling acknowledged limitation. Deaths were consistent with oxygen deprivation within a confined space. That assessment fit multiple scenarios. It did not identify one. Investigators avoided filling that gap with narrative. Detective Sarah Collins documented unknowns explicitly. Did the teens enter the pit alive? Were they incapacitated elsewhere? Did they ever leave the car? The evidence did not answer those questions. The absence of trauma suggested no prolonged violence. It did not exclude negligence. It did not exclude intent. That ambiguity defined the crime. The site itself added another layer. Dry Creek Industrial Park was active intermittently in the early 1990s. Projects started and stalled. Oversight varied. Records showed periods of minimal supervision. Overnight work occurred occasionally to meet deadlines. Officer Robert Lane interviewed former workers. One foreman described an unplanned pour. That statement did not describe a crime. It described deviation. Still, it aligned with the physical findings. Detective Michael Hayes treated that alignment cautiously. Memory after decades carries distortion. Still, when witness statements align with material evidence, they gain weight. The overnight pour explained isolation. It explained why no one noticed a vehicle. It did not explain how the Pontiac arrived there. That step remained unresolved. The crime reconstruction also addressed what didn't occur. There was no attempt to remove identifying features. VIN plates remained intact. License plates were still attached. That detail suggested concealment without foresight of discovery. If the intent was permanent disappearance, the method relied on obscurity, not destruction. That distinction mattered. It suggested opportunistic concealment rather than planned erasure. Prosecutor Emily Roberts later summarized the challenge. The crime did not present as a single act. It presented as a sequence. An initial fatal event. A period of concealment. A final burial. Each stage could involve different decisions. Different levels of intent. Without direct evidence linking them to one actor, legal thresholds remained unmet. Families struggled with that fragmentation. They wanted a singular answer. Detective Sarah Collins explained the reconstruction patiently. She emphasized what the evidence showed, not what it implied emotionally. The teens did not die from reckless joyriding. They did not disappear by choice. They were placed where discovery was unlikely. Beyond that, certainty stopped. The reconstruction gained clarity through restraint. Investigators resisted the urge to dramatize. They documented mechanics, measurements, timelines. That discipline preserved credibility. It also left space for doubt. The crime could be accidental, followed by concealment to avoid consequence. It could involve negligence elevated by fear. It could involve intent unprovable by remaining evidence. Each scenario fit parts of the record. None fit all conclusively. What was clear is that the burial transformed the event into a crime regardless of initial cause. Concealment deprived families of answers for decades. It obstructed investigation. It altered legal outcomes. Prosecutor Daniel Hayes emphasized that point in internal review. Even accidental deaths demand reporting. Burial under concrete crossed a legal boundary. The Pontiac became the primary witness. It spoke through condition, placement, and silence. Detective Michael Hayes described it as frozen testimony. It preserved the final configuration of a moment that could no longer speak for itself. That preservation allowed reconstruction. It did not deliver confession. Chapter 5 holds that tension. The crime emerges not as spectacle, but as sequence. A vehicle stops. Time passes. A decision is made to hide what cannot be undone. Evidence supports that much. Beyond it, the record ends. The concrete sealed more than bodies. It sealed certainty, leaving investigators to work within what remained. The initial investigation unfolded with methodical, painstaking effort, defined as much by what was absent as by what could be found. Within hours of the disappearance, Officer Robert Lane and Officer Linda Martinez canvassed every road leading from the high school parking lot. They spoke to classmates, parents, and nearby residents. Witnesses confirmed seeing the silver Pontiac leave the prom at 11:45, heading toward Miller's Lake. Beyond that, observations stopped. Lane meticulously recorded details that did not exist. No tire tracks, no debris, no broken fences. Those negative observations became critical data points. Detective Michael Hayes assembled the fragments, establishing a timeline from the last confirmed sighting. Each minute without new evidence narrowed potential scenarios and highlighted limitations inherent in the case. Detective Sarah Collins coordinated collection of early statements, cross-referencing accounts for consistency. Friends recalled conversations at the dance, but none could provide information on the teen's final route. Families supplied personal routines. Those were scrutinized alongside school records and work schedules. The alignment of habitual behavior with disappearance reinforced that the event was anomalous. Prosecutor Daniel Hayes advised caution. He emphasized missing persons protocols, noting that premature assumptions of foul play could contaminate future proceedings. That restrained approach maintained procedural integrity and prevented speculation from shaping public perception. Investigators recognized that, while rumors circulated rapidly, verified evidence moved slowly. Search operations expanded systematically. Law enforcement deployed ground teams across nearby fields, wooded areas, and secondary roads. Sonar equipment and cadaver dogs scanned Miller's Lake and adjacent waterways. Each negative result was logged and analyzed. Officer Lane mapped search grids digitally and physically. Dead ends were not discarded, but marked for potential re-examination. The absence of physical traces beyond the parking lot and planned route heightened investigative challenges, forcing the team to consider less conventional possibilities. That process demanded discipline and adherence to methodology in an environment where emotion and speculation could easily intrude. Early procedural efforts included review of local traffic and service records. Gas stations, convenience stores, and phone booths were canvassed for transactional evidence. No purchases or calls coincided with the disappearance. That lack of external interaction narrowed the focus to the initial route and immediate surroundings. Detective Michael Hayes assessed the likelihood of mechanical failure or detour. The evidence, or lack thereof, pointed away from accident in open terrain. It also constrained interpretations of voluntary absence. Investigator notes repeatedly highlighted that while lack of direct evidence did not indicate foul play, it created a controlled framework for reconstructing possible scenarios. As the investigation progressed, procedural teams considered environmental factors. Rainfall and weather patterns were logged. Soil compaction near the overlook was documented by Officer Linda Martinez. These observations ensured that natural variables were accounted for when evaluating potential vehicle displacement. Detective Sarah Collins maintained comprehensive case files, recording the absence of evidence as rigorously as the presence of it. That practice preserved investigative credibility over decades, ensuring later re-examinations could rely on accurate baseline data rather than recollections alone. Coordination among the core procedural team was critical. Lab analyst Jennifer Cole received physical samples collected from the overlook and vehicle interior, including clothing fibers and small trace evidence. Mark Turner verified chain of custody protocols to prevent contamination. No materials were conclusively linked to external parties, reinforcing the theory that the teens remained in controlled proximity until concealment occurred. These early investigative steps, though initially inconclusive, established evidentiary standards that would later enable definitive conclusions when the car was discovered beneath Dry Creek Industrial Park. Community interaction formed another aspect of the initial investigation. Detective Sarah Collins engaged families and neighbors, documenting behaviors and social patterns that could provide context. Routine observations, timing of neighborhood activity, unreported events, and minor deviations from daily schedules were noted. While individually minor, collectively they provided a matrix against which hypotheses could be tested. Officer Robert Lane recorded inconsistencies between memory and documented timelines, emphasizing methodological objectivity. Every piece of information, every absence of observation, was treated as data, not assumption. The investigative team revisited each procedural decision multiple times. Searches were repeated, statements re-interviewed, and patterns analyzed longitudinally. That iterative approach preserved both continuity and accountability. Detective Michael Hayes noted in his reports that the absence of discovery was itself evidence, indicating concealment or inaccessibility. That perspective shaped long-term investigative planning, guiding periodic reopenings and technological reviews over decades. Each procedural step maintained compliance with legal standards, ensuring the case could withstand judicial scrutiny whenever discovery permitted. By the conclusion of the initial investigation, procedural groundwork was robust, though incomplete. Searches were extensive, evidence was cataloged, witness statements were preserved, and environmental factors were recorded. Prosecutors ensured documentation met legal requirements for missing persons classification and potential future charges. Lab analyses provided baseline data, even when results were inconclusive. The investigative structure was in place for reinvestigation, capable of integrating new findings when they emerged. Despite the absence of immediate resolution, the methodical approach ensured that, when decades later the vehicle emerged, investigators could reconstruct events with authority, clarity, and adherence to factual integrity. This foundation defined the entire case. The initial investigation was not about sensational discovery. It was about disciplined procedure, exhaustive documentation, and establishing a factual framework within which subsequent developments would be interpreted. It demonstrated that even without immediate answers, a methodical approach preserves opportunity for resolution while maintaining trust and accountability. The legal process surrounding the prom vanishings began in the absence of the primary evidence, a situation that shaped every subsequent decision. Prosecutor Daniel Hayes immediately reviewed procedural standards for missing persons cases, ensuring investigations complied with state statutes and federal reporting requirements. With no confirmed crime scene, the office classified the case as an open missing persons matter. That classification carried implications. Law enforcement resources could be dedicated, public communications could remain factual, and investigative options were preserved without prematurely assuming criminality. At the same time, it imposed constraints. Without recovered evidence, any movement toward indictment or formal charges was legally impossible, and procedural caution governed every step. As searches expanded, all collected statements and minor evidence passed through the prosecutor's review. Emily Roberts evaluated each element for admissibility and credibility, noting discrepancies in witness recollections, while distinguishing between innocent error and material contradiction. She instructed detectives to document both what was reported and what was absent, emphasizing that omissions held weight in future proceedings. Every conversation, every trace evidence log, and every environmental observation was entered into case files with chain of custody rigor. That meticulous documentation ensured that, when discovery eventually occurred, the legal framework could support any prosecutorial decisions without challenge. In parallel, law enforcement briefings maintained clarity regarding potential charges. The absence of bodies or vehicle meant that investigators could only explore procedural violations such as obstruction, failure to report, or negligence. Prosecutors coordinated with detectives to understand which facts, if discovered later, might satisfy thresholds for criminal liability. They evaluated building permits, contractor actions, and historical site activity for procedural compliance, noting anomalies without drawing premature conclusions. That measured approach avoided speculation, maintaining the case within legal and ethical bounds while ensuring future readiness. As months turned to years, the legal posture shifted subtly. Periodic case reviews confirmed that evidence gaps precluded filing charges, but they also identified avenues for potential future action. Every search, every interview, and every minor tip was retained with the possibility of integration into a formal prosecution. Prosecutor Emily Roberts stressed the importance of transparency with families, explaining why early procedural decisions were conservative and fact-bound. That approach reinforced trust while maintaining ethical standards. When the vehicle emerged in July 2016, the legal process pivoted immediately. Discovery of the Pontiac under 2 feet of concrete transformed a missing persons case into one with tangible evidentiary weight. Prosecutors, having preserved exhaustive documentation, could assess the chain of events with confidence. Emily Roberts and Daniel Hayes reviewed timelines, site measurements, and forensic findings provided by Jennifer Cole and Mark Turner. They evaluated the potential for charges, considering both the actions of construction personnel and any subsequent interference with evidence. Procedural reviews ensured that statements collected decades earlier retained legal validity. The team examined suspect involvement with methodical care. Paul Henders, the contractor responsible for the site, became the focal point of potential liability. Investigators documented unplanned overnight concrete pours and restricted crew access, noting deviations from standard protocols. Prosecutors reviewed these actions for legal relevance, comparing them to regulatory and safety codes in effect at the time. Henders' death in late 2016 complicated potential indictment, but the procedural record preserved accountability for future legal interpretation. Every observation, from witness testimony to concrete curing patterns, was logged in alignment with evidentiary standards. Throughout the process, the legal team maintained a careful balance between fact and inference. No assumption of motive or intent was presented as evidence. Statements were framed around procedural deviation and observed anomalies rather than conjecture. Prosecutors avoided public language that could compromise impartiality or inflame speculation. That discipline allowed courts, investigators, and the community to interpret the emerging facts within a controlled, legally defensible framework. It also ensured that any narrative produced in media or official reports adhered to legal accuracy, protecting the integrity of the victims' stories. Additionally, the legal process acknowledged limits of knowledge. Cause of death remained uncertain, and no direct evidence linked specific individuals to a deliberate act. Prosecutors noted these gaps explicitly, reinforcing that unresolved questions did not imply negligence or intentional harm beyond what evidence could demonstrate. This transparency preserved the ethical obligation to truth, even in the absence of conclusive closure. It also underscored the importance of maintaining procedural rigor despite elapsed time and public pressure. The legal posture extended to family interactions. Families were briefed regularly on status, evidence review, and procedural considerations. Prosecutors explained why certain investigative avenues could not immediately yield charges, contextualizing delays in terms of legal thresholds rather than investigative failure. Detective Sarah Collins supplemented these updates with practical information on searches, witness interviews, and forensic analysis, ensuring the family perspective was consistently integrated into legal and procedural frameworks. That collaboration preserved credibility, prevented miscommunication, and maintained focus on facts rather than narrative speculation. Ultimately, the legal process in the Prom Vanishings case illustrates the centrality of method, patience, and adherence to procedure. From the moment the teens disappeared to decades later when the vehicle was discovered, prosecutors and investigators worked within well-defined legal boundaries, preserving both the integrity of the case and the rights of all involved. Documentation, chain of custody integrity, adherence to statutes, and ethical communication ensured that when evidence finally emerged, the transition from investigation to potential legal review was seamless. The process demonstrated that even in the absence of immediate crime scene evidence, careful, disciplined legal stewardship maintains authority, trust, and readiness for resolution without compromising professional or ethical standards. Evidence rarely arrives neatly, and in the Prom Vanishings case, conflicts emerged almost immediately. From the moment the Pontiac was uncovered beneath Dry Creek Industrial Park, investigators confronted inconsistencies between early reports, physical findings, and later testimonies. The initial missing persons files indicated the teens had been last seen leaving the prom at 11:45, heading toward Miller's Lake. Yet the discovery site lay outside the direct path of their expected route. Detective Michael Hayes mapped trajectories and cross-referenced witness accounts, noting subtle discrepancies. Some classmates remembered the teens turning left at the county road entrance. Others recalled right. Those contradictions, small individually, became critical when reconstructing the sequence of movement and assessing plausibility of accident versus concealment. Every statement had to be evaluated against physical evidence, and no single narrative could dominate without corroboration. Conflicts also arose in construction records. Paul Henders' company maintained logs indicating routine overnight work. Yet, interviews with former crew members suggested unplanned deviations, including the concrete pour above the car. Officer Robert Lane documented these deviations, noting that schedules conflicted with official permits. Jennifer Cole analyzed soil samples and concrete layers, confirming curing patterns consistent with Henders' account. Yet, minor anomalies suggested alterations or expedited work. Mark Turner verified chain of custody for all collected samples to rule out contamination, but discrepancies between records and now physical measurements required reconciliation. These conflicts complicated interpretations of intent and timing. For investigators, the contradictions were not obstacles to be ignored. They were data to be understood within the limitations of memory, record-keeping, and decades of elapsed time. Further tension appeared in witness memory. By 2016, decades had passed and recollections varied widely. Statements about construction activity, unusual vehicle sightings, and local traffic patterns diverged. Some foremen recalled seeing a silver Pontiac near the site. Others denied ever observing it. Detective Sarah Collins treated each claim cautiously, documenting both agreement and divergence. She emphasized that memory is fallible and susceptible to suggestion over time. By cataloging conflicts without asserting conclusions, investigators preserved credibility and avoided conflating uncertain recollections with evidence. Procedural integrity relied on maintaining this distinction, especially in a case with such temporal gaps. Physical evidence itself presented contradictions. The car showed no external impact damage, suggesting it was placed rather than crashed. Yet its location beneath concrete suggested concealment inconsistent with accidental deposition. Seat positions, gear placement, and interior conditions implied no struggle. But skeletal analysis could not definitively determine cause of death. Each piece of evidence spoke in part, yet collectively raised questions. Prosecutor Emily Roberts reviewed these conflicts in detail, noting which findings supported potential negligence, which suggested deliberate handling, and which remained ambiguous. That evaluation was critical in maintaining ethical, fact-based reporting and preventing inference from being mistaken for proof. Discrepancies in early investigative records compounded the challenge. Search logs from 1992 and 1993 indicated grids that, retrospectively, missed the eventual burial site. Mapping these records against modern GIS data revealed gaps in coverage and inconsistencies between documented searches and actual terrain features. Officer Linda Martinez compiled these findings to provide clarity, highlighting areas that were insufficiently investigated. Conflicting records did not indicate misconduct. They reflected procedural limitations of the time, but they required reconciliation to understand why the car remained hidden for decades. Media coverage also introduced conflicting narratives. Early press reports speculated on runaways or accidents, creating public assumptions that differed from internal investigative perspectives. Detective Michael Hayes and Detective Sarah Collins monitored these narratives carefully, ensuring that public perception did not pressure investigative conclusions. They documented media reports alongside factual evidence to maintain transparency. That record allowed later investigators to separate rumor from verified observation, particularly when evaluating witness statements influenced by what they had read or heard over the years. The forensic timeline contained additional conflicts. Soil composition, car placement, and concrete curing indicated burial likely occurred in mid-1993. Yet anecdotal accounts suggested the vehicle might have been placed earlier or later. Reconciling these differences required cross-referencing environmental analysis, construction logs, and witness testimony. Each discrepancy demanded careful documentation. Investigators avoided speculation, focusing on establishing the most probable sequence supported by material evidence. That approach preserved accuracy while acknowledging uncertainty. Even the victim timeline introduced minor conflicts. Friends recalled leaving the prom together, but estimates of departure time varied by several minutes. That variance, though seemingly insignificant, became relevant in reconstructing the sequence leading to disappearance. Detectives maintained multiple plausible timelines, integrating physical evidence with witness observations to produce a coherent framework without asserting unwarranted certainty. Conflicts were treated as informative constraints, guiding rather than dictating conclusions. By cataloging contradictions across statements, records, and physical evidence, the investigative team maintained procedural and ethical clarity. They recognized that conflicts do not negate evidence, they contextualize it. Detective Michael Hayes and Detective Sarah Collins emphasized documenting the nature and source of each inconsistency, noting whether it stemmed from faulty memory, incomplete records, or environmental variables. Prosecutors Daniel Hayes and Emily Roberts incorporated these notes into ongoing assessments, ensuring any future legal review could address contradictions transparently. Lab analysts Jennifer Cole and Mark Turner provided corroboration where possible, noting the limits of forensic certainty. Chapter 8 demonstrates that conflicts are inherent in prolonged investigations, particularly when evidence emerges decades after events. Each contradiction became a lens for understanding procedural limitations, witness reliability, and the sequence of events. By acknowledging and documenting these conflicts without drawing unsupported conclusions, investigators preserved both credibility and analytical clarity, ensuring that the case could be interpreted with authority, even amidst unresolved questions. Reinvestigation began decades after the disappearance, driven by both technological advancement and renewed scrutiny of unresolved questions. In 2001, a retired detective reviewed the case files, noting gaps in search coverage and inconsistencies between reported observations and environmental records. GIS mapping was applied to the 1992 landscape, overlaying original search grids with contemporary aerial imagery. Detective Michael Hayes coordinated the effort, highlighting areas where earlier searches had failed to account for topography changes, vegetation growth, and overlooked industrial sites. That spatial analysis suggested potential locations where the vehicle could have remained hidden for years, prompting renewed field surveys and targeted excavation planning. The reinvestigation was deliberate, paced to ensure methodical documentation and minimize assumptions. Advances in forensic science informed the renewed inquiry. Lab analyst Jennifer Cole re-examined preserved materials, including clothing fibers, personal items recovered from initial searches, and trace evidence from prom attire logs. DNA testing techniques had improved, allowing for verification of victim identification with higher certainty, though no external DNA was found beyond the teens themselves. Mark Turner corroborated her analysis, emphasizing chain of custody integrity across decades. These refinements did not create new discoveries, but they strengthened the evidentiary foundation, ensuring that when new physical evidence appeared, it could be integrated seamlessly into established procedural standards. Reinforcement of prior findings became a central goal. Witness re-interviews were also conducted, though they required careful calibration given the passage of time. Detective Sarah Collins approached each conversation with structured questioning, noting how memory could shift across decades. Former construction crew members, neighbors, and classmates were consulted, not for immediate revelations, but to clarify procedural ambiguities, confirm prior statements, and identify previously unreported deviations in site activity. Some memories aligned with early logs, others introduced minor conflicts, reinforcing the importance of documenting uncertainty without inferring motive or intent. That discipline preserved credibility while expanding context. The discovery of anomalies in construction documentation accelerated the reinvestigation. Henders and Sons Contracting logs indicated routine operations, yet interviews revealed unplanned overnight pours and restricted access to specific areas. Officer Robert Lane cross-checked site permits, environmental records, and soil samples, confirming that deviations coincided with periods when the Pontiac could have been buried. This alignment between physical evidence and procedural anomalies provided circumstantial weight, though it did not establish direct causality. Investigators treated the correlation cautiously, noting that timing suggested opportunity but not intent, maintaining adherence to ethical investigative practice. Reinvestigation also involved detailed environmental and geotechnical assessments. Soil compaction, concrete curing patterns, and stratigraphy were documented by both forensic and engineering specialists. These assessments clarified the method of concealment, indicating that the vehicle was deliberately placed into a prepared pit before the concrete was poured. Detective Michael Hayes noted that this controlled placement contradicted prior assumptions of accidental deposition. But investigators refrained from attributing culpability without direct evidence. The physical reconstruction was precise, accounting for variables such as equipment use, pit depth, and concrete weight, forming a procedural narrative grounded entirely in measurable fact. Timeline reconstruction became central to reinvestigation efforts. Investigators correlated the last confirmed sighting at 11:45 with site activity logs, noting that construction at Dry Creek began early in 1993. By overlaying witness accounts, environmental evidence, and project schedules, detectives Sarah Collins and Michael Hayes generated a probabilistic sequence. The Pontiac's concealment aligned with periods of minimal oversight and unplanned activity, providing a plausible explanation for its long absence. These conclusions were presented internally with careful caveats, emphasizing that certainty about the sequence could not extend to assigning responsibility. Reinvestigation also revisited initial investigative procedures. Searches conducted in the early 1990s were re-evaluated using modern standards. Officer Linda Martinez compared historical grids against current geospatial data, identifying areas previously mischaracterized as thoroughly canvassed. Detective Michael Hayes coordinated targeted re-excavation in those zones, ensuring that all procedural steps, from photographic documentation to evidence tagging, adhered to contemporary best practices. This approach preserved credibility, allowing investigators to integrate past and present findings without introducing retrospective bias. Community and family engagement remained central during reinvestigation. Detectives provided updates grounded in facts rather than speculation, emphasizing procedural milestones and the logic behind renewed field efforts. Families were informed about the rationale for revisiting older sites, the methodologies applied, and the limits of what could be confirmed. That transparency reinforced trust while maintaining adherence to investigative ethics. It also prevented emotional assumptions from contaminating procedural decision-making. The culmination of reinvestigation occurred in July 2016, when construction crews unearthed the Pontiac under 2 feet of concrete at Dry Creek Industrial Park. The vehicle's placement, condition, and interior confirmed the procedural reconstructions developed over decades. Lab verification and mapping documentation validated prior timelines, reconciling much of the earlier uncertainty. While no new perpetrator information emerged directly, the reinvestigation established the final location, clarified sequence of concealment, and connected decades of fragmented evidence into a coherent procedural record. Chapter 9 illustrates that reinvestigation is not merely repetition. It is the disciplined application of updated methods, technologies, and analytical rigor to verify and expand understanding of unresolved events. By integrating prior investigative work with new capabilities, investigators established a factual, defensible framework that preserved accuracy, maintained trust, and allowed the case to progress toward meaningful closure, even in the absence of definitive answers regarding human agency. Systemic limitations shaped the investigation of the prom vanishings from the very beginning, dictating what could be discovered, documented, and legally pursued. In 1992, Lincoln County lacked the technological resources that would later aid forensic reconstruction. Yeast mapping, advanced soil analysis, and modern DNA testing were decades away. Detective Michael Hayes noted that search operations were constrained by both terrain and manpower. Officer Robert Lane and Officer Linda Martinez canvassed by foot and vehicle, relying on visual sweeps and witness statements. Areas that would later prove critical were inaccessible or overlooked due to incomplete records, overgrown paths, and intermittent lighting. Those constraints created invisible boundaries, limiting the probability of early discovery and shaping subsequent investigative hypotheses. Communication and record-keeping presented additional systemic challenges. Many logs were handwritten, often incomplete, and stored across multiple offices with varying standards. Witness statements were collected on different forms, sometimes without clear timestamps, and later transcription introduced potential errors. Detective Sarah Collins emphasized cross-verification, but systemic inconsistencies persisted. These gaps meant that later investigators had to reconcile multiple versions of events, sometimes decades apart. Prosecutor Emily Roberts highlighted how procedural standards at the time, while compliant with regulations, lacked the rigor that modern case management systems enforce. The limitations were structural, not negligent, but they significantly affected the investigative timeline. Jurisdictional boundaries further complicated the case. Lincoln County authorities operated independently from adjacent municipalities, and early leads suggested possible movement of the vehicle along secondary roads. Coordination with neighboring precincts was slow and often informal. Requests for records, traffic logs, and environmental reports were delayed or incomplete. Officer Robert Lane documented these constraints meticulously, noting which data gaps hindered reconstruction. These systemic obstacles meant that investigators could establish plausible sequences only within the areas they could fully monitor, leaving unresolved uncertainty about movements outside their immediate jurisdiction. Legal frameworks also imposed restrictions. In the absence of recovered bodies or physical evidence, prosecutors could not pursue charges without violating standards of probable cause. Prosecutor Daniel Hayes emphasized that missing persons cases required factual grounding before invoking criminal statutes. That legal boundary constrained investigative focus. While investigators could hypothesize concealment, negligence, or accident, they could not act on unverified speculation. The systemic requirement to maintain legal defensibility shaped both the pace and scope of searches, interviews, and public communications. Investigators documented every procedural step to ensure that if evidence emerged decades later, it could be admitted in court without challenge. Technological limitations were pronounced. In 1992, surveillance cameras were rare in rural Lincoln County. Phone records were limited to landlines, and cell towers were sparse or non-existent. Trace evidence analysis relied on methods that could not detect low-concentration DNA or degraded fibers. Lab analyst Jennifer Cole noted that many samples were collected conservatively, preserving what could later be examined using improved techniques. Mark Turner verified chain of custody rigor, but he too recognized that early limitations prevented definitive conclusions about external contact or vehicular movement. The system constrained what could be confirmed scientifically, leaving investigators reliant on circumstantial and procedural observations. Environmental and industrial factors compounded systemic restrictions. Miller's Lake and surrounding terrain included private property, construction pits, and industrial development. Access required permissions that were not always immediately granted. Officer Linda Martinez documented which areas were physically inaccessible during early searches, and how natural barriers, dense vegetation, water, uneven slopes affected search coverage. That limitation influenced search patterns, leading to initial negative results and prolonging uncertainty. When the vehicle was eventually discovered, much of its concealment could be traced to these systemic barriers rather than investigative error. Human resource limitations were also evident. Detectives and officers were responsible for multiple concurrent cases. Staffing shortages and prioritization of immediate threats reduced hours available for exhaustive search. Procedural teams compensated through meticulous documentation, ensuring every tip, lead, and observation was recorded for future reference. Detective Sarah Collins coordinated volunteers and community searches, but reliance on informal reporting introduced variability in coverage and record accuracy. These systemic human factors constrained operational flexibility, affecting the speed and scope of early investigative outcomes. Policy and procedural frameworks created additional structural effects. Record retention schedules, evidence handling standards, and reporting thresholds varied across departments. Certain minor observations from initial canvassing, such as unconfirmed sighting reports or environmental anomalies, were not initially formalized. That oversight did not reflect negligence, but it introduced gaps later reconciled through reinvestigation. Detective Michael Hayes emphasized that systemic documentation practices determined what evidence could be evaluated decades later. These limitations influenced not only procedural capability, but also how investigators interpreted absence, delay, and deviation. Funding constraints shaped search methodology and forensic analysis. The county allocated limited resources for extended missing persons cases, prioritizing immediate threats. Equipment availability, laboratory capacity, and personnel hours were rationed. Officer Robert Lane's reports highlight that certain areas were only partially searched, and some evidence could not be processed promptly. These systemic resource limitations created unavoidable delays, which later reinforced the perception of procedural gaps. When modern reinvestigation occurred, those same constraints were contextualized as structural rather than negligent, helping explain why the vehicle remained undiscovered for over 2 decades. Finally, systemic limitations underscore the interplay between human judgment and procedural reality. Investigators operated within legal, technological, and environmental boundaries. They documented absences, reconciled conflicts, and preserved evidence for future verification. Each limitation, whether technological, procedural, or resource-based, shaped investigative choices, influencing outcomes without compromising ethical standards. The Prom Vanishings case demonstrates that systemic barriers, while invisible in the moment, dictate both the pace of discovery and the interpretive lens through which events are later understood. Understanding those constraints provides clarity not only about what was possible at the time, but also why resolution required decades and a reinvestigation to achieve a measure of procedural certainty. The long-term impact of the Prom Vanishings reverberated through families, the community, and law enforcement for decades. For the families of Joseph Mulaney, William Hamilton, and Nikki Bakolas, the initial disappearance imposed a sustained emotional toll, defined by uncertainty and unresolved grief. Parents and siblings faced daily reminders of absence, balancing hope with the gradual erosion of expectation. Detective Sarah Collins maintained contact with the families throughout both initial investigation and reinvestigation, documenting not only procedural developments but also the human consequences of delayed resolution. Family routines were disrupted, social networks strained, and community interactions altered by the shadow of uncertainty. That impact persisted even after discovery, as the confirmation of death, though providing evidence-based closure, reopened layers of grief that had been managed for decades. Within Lincoln County, the case influenced public perception of safety and institutional trust. Residents who had assumed accidents or runaways shaped early narratives were confronted with the reality of prolonged concealment. Officer Robert Lane and Officer Linda Martinez noted increased community engagement in neighborhood monitoring and reporting, reflecting both concern and renewed vigilance. The case became a reference point for discussions about construction oversight, site security, and the limitations of local investigative infrastructure. Community memory retained details of the missing teens, site anomalies, and procedural gaps, illustrating how a single event can embed itself in collective consciousness, shaping norms, expectations, and cautionary practices for years. The professional impact on law enforcement was equally profound. Detectives Michael Hayes and Sarah Collins, along with their supporting officers, confronted procedural constraints, technology gaps, and the challenge of maintaining rigorous documentation over decades. Each stage of investigation, from initial searches to the reinvestigation prompted by the vehicle's discovery, reinforced lessons about record-keeping, evidence preservation, and procedural transparency. The case highlighted the necessity of maintaining ethical, methodical approaches even when immediate results are absent. Officers and prosecutors involved gained insight into balancing legal boundaries with investigatory creativity, understanding that procedural discipline preserves credibility and prepares cases for potential resolution long after initial activity. The investigative methodology developed for the Prom Vanishings influenced broader procedural practice. Lab analysts Jennifer Cole and Mark Turner demonstrated the value of preserving evidence for decades, allowing later advances in DNA and trace analysis to confirm identity and contextualize findings. Their work illustrated how long-term evidence stewardship is critical in cold cases, emphasizing that initial inconclusiveness does not preclude eventual resolution. The integration of environmental studies, construction documentation, and witness re-interviews established a model for comprehensive reinvestigation, balancing scientific rigor with ethical caution. Lessons from these methods informed subsequent investigations in Lincoln County and beyond, illustrating that careful documentation, transparency, and patient verification produce enduring value, even when immediate outcomes are unattainable. For the broader public and media, The case became emblematic of the complexities inherent in missing persons investigations. Early coverage, often speculative, contrasted sharply with procedural reports, highlighting tensions between narrative desire and evidentiary constraints. Prosecutors Daniel Hayes and Emily Roberts emphasized that communication needed to be precise, factual, and ethically grounded. That approach reinforced trust in institutional processes and helped manage expectations when resolution was delayed. The long-term impact thus included not only emotional and operational consequences, but also an enduring example of how careful, disciplined practice preserves authority and mitigates sensational misrepresentation. Culturally, the prom vanishings left an imprint on collective memory and local lore. High school traditions, community events, and even industrial planning were subtly influenced by awareness of the case. The eventual discovery under Dry Creek Industrial Park reinforced perceptions of hidden risks, procedural oversight, and the unpredictability of long unresolved disappearances. While the legal conclusion remained constrained by limited evidence and the death of the primary suspect, the procedural narrative offered a form of closure grounded in documentation, reconstruction, and transparency. It demonstrated that long-term impact is not solely emotional but also structural, shaping investigative standards, community behavior, and institutional awareness for generations. Even after the case's formal closure, the ripple effects persisted. Families, investigators, and the broader community continued to process both the procedural triumphs and the unresolved questions. The prom vanishings reinforced the human cost of delayed discovery, the necessity of systemic rigor, and the value of disciplined, patient investigation. Detective Michael Hayes reflected that the case exemplified how persistent adherence to evidence-based methodology preserves opportunity for resolution while honoring the humanity of victims. For Lincoln County, and for law enforcement and communities observing from afar, the case became both cautionary and instructive, a reminder that the long-term impact of unresolved crime extends beyond immediate loss, influencing practices, perceptions, and lives for decades after the initial event. The prom vanishings conclude with a measured, restrained closure, shaped not by spectacle but by careful reconstruction and acknowledgement of enduring uncertainty. When the Pontiac was finally uncovered beneath Dry Creek Industrial Park, decades of methodical investigation converged into a single, undeniable fact. Joseph Mulaney, William Hamilton, and Nikki Bakolas had perished, and their final location was documented with precision. The core procedural team, including Detective Michael Hayes, Detective Sarah Collins, Officer Robert Lane, and Officer Linda Martinez, verified the physical evidence, corroborated timelines, and ensured chain of custody protocols remained intact. Lab analysts Jennifer Cole and Mark Turner confirmed the identity of the remains with forensic certainty, grounding closure in verifiable fact rather than assumption or anecdote. Prosecutors Daniel Hayes and Emily Roberts reviewed all procedural documentation, emphasizing the legal and ethical boundaries of conclusions. Closure in this case is not predicated on attributing motive or assigning criminal culpability beyond what evidence supports. Paul Henders, the contractor whose actions coincided with the vehicle's concealment, had passed away prior to any indictment, leaving questions of intent unresolved. The investigative narrative, therefore, focuses on procedural truth. The car was deliberately placed, the teen's whereabouts confirmed, and the sequence of concealment reconstructed with as much certainty as material evidence allows. Every action from early searches to reinvestigation is presented transparently, including gaps, conflicts, and unresolved ambiguities. Detective Sarah Collins ensured that family briefings and procedural documentation explicitly acknowledged what remained unknown, reinforcing ethical standards and preserving credibility. The closure also emphasizes the human dimension of the case. Victims are remembered not merely as subjects of investigation, but as individuals with lives, routines, and communities disrupted by disappearance. Family impact, community awareness, and the decades-long process of uncertainty are incorporated into the narrative to honor the lived experiences surrounding the event. This restrained reflection underscores that closure is not synonymous with certainty about human actions. It can coexist with unresolved questions while providing factual resolution about what is known.